Hello, let's look at this pepper and then let's try to figure out how we could recreate this pepper as a vector illustration without using the tracing features or without having it look too basic. The great thing about this pepper is that it has a lot of variation in its color and presence because of the light and the shadows, the reflections off of the shiny skin of the pepper. So this is a really good example for us to move through the gradient mesh tool. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at some of the techniques used with the gradient mesh to gain realistic looking images. The first thing that I want to show you is a little trick, and it'll help save us some time down the road. This file that you'll be using with this video has a base layer set up called the pepper reference, and I'd like you to duplicate that layer, and what we're going to do is we're going to use that new layer and the artwork on it to do an image trace. I know I said we're not going to use image trace to make the pepper, but this is a little shortcut to get us the colors that are in this pepper isolated into a color palette group. So with the pepper selected on the new layer, and the reason I'm doing it on a duplicate layer is because we're going to get rid of it after we trace it. We need to be able to see the original pepper, so that just keeps this one safe. In fact, I can even lock it just to make sure I don't screw up anything. So with this pepper selected, I'm going to go do my image trace options, and I'm going to choose 16 colors. And it'll go through the image, trying to figure out how this thing is assembled, and how to break it down into various shapes and color. Boom, there you have it. This is only 16 colors. You could increase the palette amount or less. And you can do all of that by going to the image trace panel, which is that button right there. And that gives us a few options that we should look at before we expand this. And that would be, are you sure you want 16 colors? Would you like more? It doesn't, we don't worry about paths and whatnot because it's going to be going away. But I do want to ignore the white. I don't want white to be one of these colors, so I'm going to choose ignore white, and it will not be considered one of the colors that it has to worry about. So we'll gain one more color somewhere in the pepper, which is cool. Okay, so there is the finished trace for that. I'm going to close this panel, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit expand. And when I hit expand, it eliminates the white, and now it's only the different paths and colors that the pepper represents loosely. If I go to my swatches panel, down the bottom of that panel is a little folder button, and it's called New Color Group. If I click on that right now, while all those lines are still selected, and all those paths and colors are selected, boom, what I want to call it, I'll call it pepper. And so here you can see create from what? Selected swatches? No, because I don't have any swatches selected over here. What I want to do is create the color group from selected artwork. And boom, I hit OK, and I get this folder with all of those different colors from that pepper put into this color group. And it's going to save me a great amount of time later on. So now I can delete that artwork. I can even go to my layers panel and delete that duplicate layer just so it's out of the way, and then I can unlock that pepper layer. First order of business is I'd like you to go through another step with me that will help us work in this process. Actually, no, we won't get there yet. We'll do it in a second. So gradient meshes work best with a very primitive shape, ideally a square or a rectangle. So on the layer that's designated for new mesh, select that layer, and let's go to our rectangle tool and draw a rectangle that is basically the size of our pepper, top to bottom, left to right. So this is a good start. Okay, this start right here is just a rectangle. It doesn't look anything like a pepper. In fact, yours might not be green because maybe it was set to the default rectangle colors of a white fill and a black stroke. Change it so that there's no stroke, and then the fill color at this point could be any color, but I'm starting with green just to help make life kind of easy. The problem here though is that this rectangle now obscures the image of the pepper, so I can't really reference the shape and the colors very well until I change the setup of how I view my document. Right now the document is set up under view to be a preview, but I could change it to be outline. If I change it to be outline, then it sets any form and shape of like paths or images to be just outlines. The problem with this right now, however, is that we don't see the pepper anymore. The pepper's gone. So I'm going to go back to view and I'm going to set it to preview. So the one thing that I can do to make sure that I maintain the image of the pepper so I can use it as a reference is I go to the pepper layer, double click on it, and if I set it to be a template and choose OK, well, I should probably go back and set my dim images to like, I don't know, 80 or something. That's better. That way it won't be too dim. And then if I go to view as outline, it keeps the pepper visible because it knows that I'm using it as a template. So it doesn't treat it as if it's part of the artwork of the other paths. So the layer that I have as a new mesh, this rectangle, is now represented by just an outline of it. So I can continue to work with this. And this is kind of important here because I need to see the form and shape of this pepper, its contours and whatnot. It is at this point that I am now ready to use the gradient mesh tool. So I'm going to come over and I'm going to select the gradient mesh tool, and I am going to do some initial editing to help me create the form of this mesh. And I'm going to consider the top of the bumps and then the little valleys to be places where I'd like to click. And I'm going to click on the outer edge along the top first. So that outer click right there gives me a vertical line that runs straight down, and I have now sort of bisected this square into having two segments. I will do it at the top again, right where the valley is, and then I'll do it on the top of the next bump, and then the valley, and then the bump, and there's another valley right there, and I guess one more for that bump. I will then go along the outer edge and click once at the outer curved part here, maybe another one right about here because there's a little bit of an inset curve there, and then I'll do one more. Should I do one more? Maybe not yet. So I'm just going to do that. So horizontally, I've cut this into 3 horizontal segments, but there's a bunch of vertical ones. At this point, now what I can do is I can zoom in to these points, and just still with my mesh tool, I can grab and drag the points to where I want them to be. But notice this was a corner, so it kept the corner Beziers. I'm going to have to change those Beziers to work with me so that I can actually define the shape of this pepper a little more accurately. So you will start moving points around to get them, more precisely where they need to be. This one will come down into the valley. This one will come back up a little bit. And you're going to end up, that's not what I wanted to do. My space bar. You'll end up accessing all these points, and you have to be very careful that when you click on a point, you only have the icon of the mesh, not a plus sign. Because if you're a little bit off and you click, you're going to add a whole new row or column or both, depending on where you click. So you have to be very careful to only select the point and get used to what that icon looks like. Okay. So I'm just going to do a quick edit of where I want these points to be so that it starts to look like the outline of the pepper. So I'll continue here, and I'm going to change my corner Bezier so that it reflects the actual curvature of the pepper. Move this guy over and down a little bit. Don't worry, I won't get too OCD like I have a tendency to. This one needs to come in. I'll have to make a little bit of room for it, so I'll move that one over. I should talk about what's going on right there, but I won't just yet. That's an important lesson. And then I'll mess with my Bezier on that guy, bring that over. Look at this one. Futz with it a tad, looks okay. And then I'm getting down to this bottom corner, and things are gonna have to start to move. And this is where we need to take a look at the big picture again and say, where do these curves taper inwards towards the bottom? So I know that this is the top bump of this segment of the pepper, so this one would probably need to be right about here. This curve needs to come into that corner. So then a quick adjustment of those handles. I could pull this in, adjust the handle. Womp womp. This one needs to come out a little bit more for that bump. I think this one can be a little longer. That works. This segment is the valley. So that means that my valley at the bottom is barely noticeable, but it's right about there. And then this is the bump for that segment. I need to mess with my curves a little bit, but I'll get into that detail just in a second. So that would be the center of the bump here. This is another valley, so I follow that down, tuck it into that valley. Here's the top of that segment's bump, and that would mean that it's here. This is the valley that goes like that. So that will be in there. This is the top of that segment and its bump, and then I can find that right about there. And then this is the other sort of corner of the pepper. So this is looking a little messed up because the lines are kind of going all over the place. And that's where we have to spend the time, the detailed sort of evaluation of how the actual mesh that we're creating should wrap around this pepper. Right now they're still very rectangular in the middle, so I need to address that. And the first thing that I will do is start to play with the Beziers in more detail. And one thing that you need to know about Bezier handles and the way they work is, here's a great example of there being some trouble. Down here, this handle from this point extends beyond this handle from that point, and that would create a really strange looking gradient. So you never want to have handles that are adjacent to each other extending into their own space. So that's one detail you have to look at for sure. The other one is that there are sometimes going to be more pointed sort of corners, not rounded, and that's when you're going to need to access the convert or the anchor point tool. On some programs it's called the convert vertex tool, but the anchor point tool will allow you to say, okay, on this point here, how can I get you? I need you. There we go. If I grab a Bezier handle, instead of it mirroring the handle on the other side, it allows me to break that connection. So here I need to have more of a sharp bend downwards, so I'm going to grab those handles and actually point them down. And then this one, I'm switching back to my direct selection tool, not the anchor point tool. I'm going to take that and kind of tweak that one a little bit. So the access that you have to these different vertices is really kind of a critical time to think about what these different tools do. If I grab this handle with my direct selection tool, see how it mirrors my movement and my angle on the opposite side of that point. Well, I don't want that, so that's when I need my anchor point tool, so I can say you need to bend downwards on that side and come down here so that they operate independently. That's a really important thing to know. Alright, so there's that. Now I'll do the top real quick. Well, you know what? I actually won't, because I have a shortcut thing that we'll look at. I'm going to just now take these points and think about the flow of how this pepper should look. So these guys, you really want to change the Bezier so that they're pointed in the direction of the slope of, you know, the contours. So something like that ends up working in our favor because it's actually forming the shape of the, it's like bumped out, right? So it kind of bumps up, it bumps out. So I'm taking what once was a very rectangular mesh and I'm giving it more organic form so that it actually follows and behaves like a pepper. Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? Alright, so you get the idea. I would then take the time to, you know, bump this one up, maybe bump this down here, maybe bump that one down, and then paying attention to all those Bezier handles, going in and saying, is there overlap right here? There sure is, and I can't have that, so I have to adjust those, I have to adjust these so that they're not overlapping. And then I'll have a mesh that starts to actually feel like almost a 3D rendering of this thing instead of it just being so structured. I have finished a mesh that's ready to go, and it's called finished mesh. Okay, so you can turn that one on after you've messed with the other ones a bit. You really do need to mess with it, engage with the points and with the Bezier handles and really get a feel for how you start to adapt the form to the model that you're trying to create. So now let's talk about color. This is where the palette group, the color palette, swatch group, whatever that we created earlier comes in really handy. So I'm going to open up my swatches and I'm going to just take that. I want that in my own window. How do I do that? I forget how I do that. Can I do that? Can I break it and do its own? No, I don't think I can. So maybe I'll do large thumbnail and just do this and pull the swatches off. Alright, so that works for me. Large thumbnail group that has all of those colors that I created from that trace. Now what I can do is I can start grabbing points, making sure I don't have a plus sign next to it, and saying, okay, this color right there, or that point, needs to be, I'll have to make this a little taller, one of these light guys, so like that, okay? And then maybe even this one right next to it's going to be a similar shade, and then that one's going to be more of a darker green, and then darker green. But I can't see anything that's going on because I'm in outline view. If I change it back to preview, you'll see that there actually is a little bit of gradation happening between those points, but I don't really have the pepper to reference still. So I'm going to go back to outline, and here's another trick. If I pull up my info, no, it's my navigator, sorry. My navigator, and I make this bigger. I don't have my graphics tablet right now, so I'm just using the frickin' trackpad on my laptop, and it's so annoying. Whoa, that's not what I want to do. That's fine actually, but okay. There, you can see my pepper. There's an example rendering of the pepper while I'm still in this view here. I can go along and say, I need you to be these specific values at these points, and as I change it, you can see it reflected in the navigator, and that's really helpful. This one's going to be a darker green, and you kind of just have to go through the whole image defining what these values are so that you get a nice organic mesh of these gradients that produce a more realistic representation of the vegetable. So let's see, I'll just do that. No, that was definitely wrong. Which one do I have? I need that to be darker. Cool. So if I went through all of these points and said, you know, I need you and you know, one thing I've never tried is to group select points, but that would probably work. It takes a little bit of effort and energy and patience. This one won't be as bright, but then these guys are definitely a darker green. And there are going to be multiple times that you click the plus sign and you don't really realize it, and all of a sudden you're adding new parts to your mesh. So I'm going to call that good right there. I'm just going to go back to preview so we can see it. Deselect. And you can now get an idea of how this really is starting to come to life. And you see people use the mesh, you know, for not just sort of simple organic shapes, but even really complex things like portraits of people or animals, and it just blows your mind. Just Google gradient mesh Illustrator and look at all of the images that come up of what people have done, and most of them will just kind of blow your mind and hopefully inspire you to try it. But this takes us to a whole new level of visual representation. We're no longer looking at solids and graphic shapes. We're actually manipulating the points and the paths to hold up different color data and then blend into each other. It's really awesome. So there's how the mesh tool works. You should try to finish the pepper and see how close you can get it to looking. Notice I didn't do the stem. The stem would be a whole nother rectangle that you would then manipulate into a new mesh. I should just say one quick thing is it ends up being very tempting to say, come on, why aren't you, oh, wrong tool. Very tempting to say, well, why wouldn't I just use the pen tool and I'll make a new layer. If I'm going to do this stem, why wouldn't I just draw the actual shape of this thing and then add the mesh to it? And I'll show you why. I'll just get close. That wasn't that close, but good enough. All right, so if this was the stem shape, and I went to my gradient mesh tool and I click, it doesn't know where the top and bottom is, so it doesn't actually carry the path all the way to what you would consider to be the top. It ends it right there. And if I went across, instead of going across like this, it finds another place for it to go. So you cannot create effective meshes with elaborate shapes. You have to start off with a primitive. So I would start off with a rectangle, probably something about like this. Okay. And then I would come in with my mesh tool and give myself just a few segments. Nothing crazy yet, because if I make the original or the base form first, then any other segments that I want to create will work much more the way that you would anticipate it to. So here I would do that, and I would say that this is for the bend, and the bend is going to come upwards. And it looks like crazy stuff right now because all the Beziers are still thinking that I'm dealing with hard corners on a rectangle. But before too long, I should be able to get something that ends up looking like the stem based on the actual geometry of how it would be modeled by like a 3D artist or something. So I'll change that to go like this. I need to zoom in, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time here right now. Oh, should I, just to give you the final glimpse of why I did it this way? Sure. Okay. There's overlapping Bezier handles. Make sure that doesn't happen. Sometimes you have to move them out of the way a little bit. This one is a little crazy because it was the corner. Don't want those to overlap, so I'll back that one off. This guy needs to point, it's the wrong one, in the proper direction. And then I got a bunch of overlaps right here. That's why all those lines are a little weird. But this should take care of it. Silent part of the video while Greg works on making the perfect pepper stem. That looks better. Pretty darn close to being good enough. So there is a more appropriate mesh. And the cool thing, like I'm saying, is now if I go back to my mesh tool and I add different segments, it more or less carries through to maintain the proper shape that this pepper deserves. Right? So there's a few little wonky things, but you can fix that very quickly. And there you go. All right. Thanks for watching.